Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Mission Iran, Special Forces Berlin and Operation Eagle Claw, JTF 1-79, by James Stejskal. Narrated by Jim Seybert. Publisher's note: this audiobook includes bonus material. Please visit tantor.com and type Mission Iran into the search box. Follow the link to the book's page. Then, under the Supplemental Content section, please enter the access code STORM, and then click the Unlock button to access the bonus material. The code should be entered in all lower-case letters, STORM. All photographs accompanying this audiobook can be found in the bonus material. Introduction. Diplomats serving abroad for the United States are often confronted with difficult and dangerous tasks. Difficult because living conditions in some countries are less than optimal by the typical American standards. Dangerous because Americans are often targeted by terrorists, criminals, and even the government of the host country. That was certainly true in the late 1970s, when revolutionaries overran the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran, and took over 50 American diplomats prisoner on November 4, 1979, a hostage incident that lasted 444 days. But the story did not start on that day. Its roots lie in the complicated relationship that had existed between the two countries since the early 1940s. The overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh through an army coup, supported by the British and the U.S. governments, reinstated Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Friendly to the United States, the Shah guaranteed a steady supply of oil in return for economic and military aid. But as with most despots, the Shah refused to permit political freedom. His regime was condemned by Iranian nationalists, who saw the United States as the real power behind the peacock throne. Riots in 1963 led to suppression of the opposition and crackdowns against anyone seen as a threat to the government. Arrests were numerous, and the Shah's Savak, the intelligence and security organization of Iran, gained a reputation for ruthlessness and brutality. Among those arrested was the religious leader Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a bitter foe of the United States who was later exiled to France. Between 1963 and 1979, the Shah spent the majority of Iran's budget on weapons and failed to promote economic progress or expand democratic freedoms. A disgruntled populace resorted to revolution. With the government nearing collapse, the Shah fled the country on January 16, 1979. Khomeini returned to Tehran in February 1979 to lead a new government and immediately launched into a campaign of vitriol against the Great Satan, the United States of America. When President Jimmy Carter permitted the Shah to travel to the United States for medical treatment in August 1979, the Ayatollah stepped up his rhetoric, and protests against the United States started to take an ominous turn. By November, political dynamics in Iran and the international arena reached a fever pitch. Khomeini's supporters turned to violence to drive opposition parties from their government positions and consolidate complete control, while he demanded the Shah's extradition back to Iran for trial. On November 4, 1979, student supporters of the Ayatollah seized the U.S. Embassy with over 60 hostages. Relations between the two countries headed south. It was a situation never before experienced in American diplomacy. Europeans had been touched by international terrorism since the late 1960s, but for most Americans, the Iran hostage crisis was a watershed. It was one of the first times America felt terrorism so directly and on such a large scale. The Cold War was in full swing, and the United States had only begun to fight international terrorism, only begun to understand the tactics of terror that are now all too familiar. The learning curve, both political and military, has been steep and often deadly. What follows is one piece of that history. Chapter 1. A Short History of Detachment A, Berlin, 39th Special Forces Detachment. When Nazi Germany fell at the end of World War II, its capital, Berlin, quickly became a point of contention between the Soviets and the Western allies of the United States, Britain, and France. At the Yalta Conference, these allies finalized their agreement to divide Germany into zones of occupation. The Americans, British, and French occupied what would be known as West Germany, while the Soviets occupied East Germany. Deep within the Soviet zone, Berlin was similarly divided into 4 zones of occupation. Although the Allies had small numbers of troops in Berlin compared to the East German and Soviet forces that surrounded the city, they were prepared to defend the city. Although the small Allied occupation in Berlin would be little more than an annoyance to the massive group of Soviet forces in Germany, it could serve as a delaying force to slow their advance. A relative newcomer to the world, the U.S. Army Special Forces was established in 1952, the brainchild of several veterans of World War II. The progenitor was the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, a unique organization that was responsible for espionage, sabotage, and other forms of unconventional warfare, UW. When the OSS was disbanded in 1945, the conventionally minded Army saw no need for UW and chose not to replace its capabilities. Others disagreed with that assessment, including General Robert McClure, who ran psychological warfare operations for General Eisenhower, and Colonels Aaron Bank, Wendell Fertig, and Russell Volkmann, all of whom had run guerrilla operations against the Axis during the war. Together, they realized the U.S. military needed UW capability, and they convinced the Joint Chiefs of Staff to form the first unit of its kind in the U.S. Army, the 10th Special Forces Group, Airborne. The 853 men of the 10th deployed to Bad Tolz, Germany in the fall of 1953. Detachment A was established in the summer of 1956, in response to a request by the commander of U.S. forces in Berlin, U.S. Cub, to provide him with demolition squads to destroy strategic targets outside the city. Plans were made to assign 6 U.S. Army Special Forces SFA teams to Berlin Command, who were to assist with harassing and delaying any Soviet advance toward West Germany in the event of war. 6 teams were secretly deployed from Bad Tolz in Berlin to form the unit, and were stationed at the former Telefunken factory complex, and ostensibly assigned to Headquarters 6th Infantry Regiment. They would be known as the Security Platoon. In April 1958, the unit moved again, this time several kilometers across town to Andrews Barracks, where it was hidden within the headquarters and headquarters company of U.S. Army Garrison Berlin. It was a location that would permit expansion and better security. The unit was renamed Detachment A, and was simply called the Detachment, or Det A for short. In official planning documents, the unit was referred to as Special Forces Berlin, and was officially designated as the 39th Special Forces Detachment on August 27, 1965. Unconventional warfare experts. The 39th's classified mission was that, upon the outbreak of general hostilities, or under certain conditions of localized war, the teams would destroy targets inside the city of Berlin and nearby East Germany, selected by the U.S. Cub as vital to his defense of the city, as well as primary targets in the U.S. European Command, EUCOM, Unconventional War Plan. Once that tasking was completed, the teams would conduct UW operations as directed by Commander, Support Operations Task Force Europe, SOTFI. The concept was for each team to link up with local guerrilla forces to assist them to organize, train, and fight the Soviet forces. It was an ambitious and extremely dangerous mission. Some would call it suicidal. The unit operated under a light cover of supporting the mission of the Berlin Brigade, without much more depth than not revealing the presence and true status of a Special Forces unit. The men all spoke German, or at least one Eastern European language. Essentially, the unit members had to live 3 covers. The first was as a member of an army unit assigned to Berlin, including wearing the uniform, carrying the ID card, and the usual protocol that went with that. The second was as a civilian living in Berlin, including a U.S. civilian ID, civilian clothing, with a story like student, tradesman, barkeeper, medical field, whatever their background would support. And the third was reserved for war, foreign identity cards and a suitable cover. In that case, given civilian identity cards and non-U.S. passports, it was expected they would be able to operate clandestinely when and if war with the Warsaw Pact began. Day-to-day training included everything from weapons marksmanship, explosives, radio communication, and identification of Soviet uniforms, equipment, and units, to more esoteric subjects such as intelligence tradecraft, surreptitious methods of entry, disguises, cell organization, and caches. While no other special operations-type unit was practicing this kind of operation at the time, Detachment A was employing it on a daily basis. Something called urban unconventional warfare. Special Forces progenitor, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, had trained on and used similar tactics and methods, collectively known as intelligence tradecraft, during World War II. Skills passed on to its replacement, the Central Intelligence Agency. Due to the nature of the counterinsurgency war in Vietnam, the U.S. Army Special Forces had distanced itself, for the most part, from the urban portion of these activities, which, at the most basic level, were the same skills intelligence agencies used to conduct clandestine agent operations. These skills include conducting surveillance of targets and individuals, counter-surveillance, sometimes called surveillance detection, agent handling operations, and technical and non-technical communications. Communications in an enemy-controlled urban area are not only crucial, but dangerous as well. Technical communications required the unit's operators, either alone or as a member of a team, to use HF, high-frequency radios, in an urban area. This was no easy task when you had to conceal a 50 to 100-foot-long wire antenna and send messages quickly to prevent enemy radio detection finders from discovering your location. Non-technical communications are those methods used for operators and agents to maintain clandestine, hidden contact. These include casing operations, the same skills used by criminals to case and rob a bank, dead letter drop, DLD or DD, brush passes, BP, brief encounters, BE, as well as the use of signal sites, codes, and secret writing, all very esoteric skills. These subjects were usually taught by former intelligence officers in the employ of what was euphemistically called the Other Government Agency, or OGA, including CIA instructors who worked under such code names as Team 10. Red Sails. Once their clandestine tradecraft skills were up to par, the unit's operators put them into practice in daily operations inside Berlin and elsewhere. That gave the unit a capability that no other special operations element in the U.S. military possessed. One specific training operation called Red Sails illustrates why. It was a key reason the unit was chosen for the Iran rescue mission. In early 1978, the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, also known as MI6, sought out assistance from the United States to train local British security forces in how to better identify and track terrorist teams that might try to carry out operations in the UK. Since the early 1970s, the Irish Republican Army, IRA, had successfully infiltrated small sabotage teams into mainland UK who would select a target, conduct surveillance, and then attack it with explosives or firearms. Up to that point, a number of attacks had been carried out by the IRA, including bombings in London, Birmingham, and Bristol. SIS wanted to use outside specialists to simulate a terrorist operation in order to make the training more realistic, as opposed to using the British SAS, who had the home field advantage. The exercise would test British inter-service capabilities to track a terrorist team in and around Southampton, a large port city in the coastal region of southwestern England. The SIS MI6 officers acted as exercise controllers, while MI5 and local police were the local security force that was learning from the exercise. But as is often the case with America's British cousins, there was a larger agenda. When the request was received, SOTFE tasked Detachment A to conduct the exercise that was codenamed Red Sails. The first team to go consisted of 4 operators with extensive experience who initially thought they would teach terrorists modus operandi to police officers. They were quickly disabused of that notion and told they were expected to act as terrorists themselves, and were given several missions to accomplish. They would be a clandestine red team to test British security procedures while law enforcement tried to catch them in the act. With that, the team realized the game was stacked against them. Their rental car, hotel rooms, even the targets they were to notionally attack had been chosen by their hosts. There was only one thing to do, so they changed the game, abandoned everything they had been provided with, and made new arrangements, effectively disappearing from the scene. They had prepared for eventualities, however, primarily because no one trusted either the American command which gave them this training tasking or their British cousins, who were never beyond changing the rules to fit their needs. The one thing they couldn't change was the targets the controllers chose for the Americans to reconnoiter, locations similar to what terrorists would have also selected, such as police stations and electrical transformer yards. The team decided to use their best tradecraft. No public meetings, only clandestine messages passed through dead drops to accomplish their tasks. Their approaches to the targets were carefully choreographed to avoid the British surveillance they knew would be watching for them. Going underground meant they often had to sleep rough, away from hotels and conveniences. Several of the team made contact with old friends who were easily persuaded to join in the games. Non-technical communications were used to eliminate the dangers of open telephone lines. Dead drops and brief encounters made passing messages more cumbersome and less timely, but it was secure. Occasional missteps had to be dealt with as well. One operator was compromised when his hidden handheld radio was discovered in the flophouse room he had rented. The owner was a retired police constable and quickly reported the man to authorities. He was promptly arrested. The British tried to play him back against his teammates by calling for an emergency meeting, but the safety code words needed to authenticate the message were left out by the arrested and very chagrined operator. The meeting went down, but not as the police expected. A young Briton who had been enticed by a reward delivered a butcher-wrapped package of pig offal to the meeting. He was detained and questioned without revealing any information, and the 3 remaining team members were able to complete their sabotage tasks successfully. 2 subsequent versions of Red Sails were run after MI6 decided the exercise was better run as an unscripted game, which allowed the Americans even more advantages. Such were the results that the British sent a letter to the commander of Detachment A that requested the team be seconded to the SIS for service in Northern Ireland. All along, it seems, the exercises were intended to see if the Americans were suitable to infiltrate the IRA in Northern Ireland. Apparently, they were. Counterterrorism. The unit had operated under its single tasking of unconventional warfare until 1975, when it was assigned a secondary mission of counterterrorism, CT, under U.S. Army Europe Concept of Operations Plan 0300, User Conplan 0300. The first order of business was to train for the current threat, aircraft hijackings. In 1974, Detachment A had been assigned the responsibility for providing sniper support to the Berlin Brigade in the event an American aircraft was hijacked in Berlin. As Berlin was still under Allied occupation, any hijacking or terrorism problem in the city fell under the Allied jurisdiction, and all aircraft that landed in West Berlin belonged either to Pan Am, British Airways, Air France, or their subsidiaries. The unit's first external CT training began with the FBI. Using the general requirement to support the brigade, Det A's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Shacknow, coordinated the attendance of 6 members of Det A at a special FBI anti-air crimes course in the spring of 1974. The 6 included Captain Mercer Mac Dorsey, Lieutenant Grail Farr, Sergeant First Class John Niffenegger, Staff Sergeant Kevin Monahan, Sergeant First Class Donald Earhart, and Captain Richard LaHue. Along with the FBI agents undergoing the training, several Canadian mounted police officers, 2 German Federal Intelligence Service BND officers, and a team of German Federal Border Protection Group 9 GSG-9 officers, including their commander Colonel Ulrich Wegener, attended the course. Grail Farr later recounted the training. When we assumed the counter-skyjacking mission, we asked around for training. The FBI had a lot of skyjacking experience by that time and had the best possible scenarios and facilities. An actual DC-8, FBI former airline pilots, air controllers, and stewardesses as role players, so it was exactly what we needed to begin with. The team of 6 personnel was sent to Quantico for a custom-tailored air crimes training course. There were other outsiders there at the same time, including a team from GSG-9, who made a lousy impression during the course. They did not want to exert themselves physically, giving the impression they were above the drudgery of actual training. In my day, airline security consisted of having passengers identify their bags as they boarded the aircraft. That was a big innovation and assumed to be certain insurance against onboarding bombs. The FBI training did not include any CQB-type, close-quarter battle, action. The FBI Special Weapons and Tactics SWAT teams, with whom we trained, were really upgunned after their own SWAT qualification. From .38 revolvers to .357 revolvers, rapid reloads were accomplished with loose rounds from your pocket. The GSG-9 guys were all impressive SS recruiting poster-looking guys, where the BND officers were sort of nondescript. Colonel Wegener gave a great slideshow about GSG-9 training and equipment. After the briefing, our FBI host asked to hear about the Munich Olympic disaster, which Wegener had witnessed as an aide-de-camp to the Federal Interior Minister. Wegener refused. The FBI guy politely reminded him that everyone there was there to expressly learn how to deal with possible similar threats, such as the coming Olympics in Canada. Wegener simply said, "No dice." 2-week SWAT training focused on team building, getting FBI agents accustomed to working alone or in pairs, to operate as a small tactical unit. The GSG guys treated the BND pair, who actually did as well or better at everything than the GSGs, like they were not in any sense part of the same team. The GSG-9 guys also opted out of specific events, notably the PT, which often included team combatives. In one such incident, we ran 2 or 3 miles to complete a marine obstacle course and ran back, timed by team finishes, and convened in the gym. That day we had lions and tigers. 2 teams at a time were outfitted with helmets, crotch protectors, and boxing gloves. Teams sat back to back. When a whistle blew, the object was to throw the opposing team members off the mat until only one team remained. Wegener listened and refused. "Steht nicht in Dienstplan," he said. "It's not on the training schedule." So the Germans stood and watched, while the FBI guys, Mounties, and SF guys battered and threw each other around. and their demeanor suggested that they were thereby demonstrating their superiority. Marksmanship was nothing special either. A couple of the Mounties were marksmanship trainers, and I became the first trainee in some time to ring up a perfect score on the rifle, then pistol, 5-range station moving target course. On that same course, one GSG-9 guy a couple of stations down began to miss. He got madder and madder and was acting more out of control, almost childish, until the FBI range safety officer halted the exercise. Wegener went out and chewed the guy's ass, and we all eventually finished, 2 pistol shots at a rapidly moving close-in target, the course. Meanwhile, the 2 BNDs had quietly been dinging targets as consistently as the Mountie marksmanship instructors and some of the SF guys and a bunch of FBI agents. The results of that training were taken back to Berlin, where the training was continued with the help of Pan Am Airlines at Tegel International Airport. Teams trained on the active flight line, acting as ground crews and baggage handlers. Although they were met with some hostility from the German airport employees, once they understood the reasoning, their attitude toward the Americans changed dramatically. SF Berlin members were permitted to handle actual incoming and departing flights, with some supervision, during the day. At night, the teams moved to a secluded section of the airfield and practiced dynamic entry techniques on Pan Am's stable of Boeing 37 and 727 aircraft. Scenarios for full-on aircraft assaults were conducted, with role players for terrorists, passengers, and the crews, until every team was considered up to standard, although no specific standards had yet been developed. After each scenario was run, everyone, role players and team members, would conduct a hot wash debriefing to determine successes and deficiencies. Organization. Detachment A was organized as a Special Forces B team, a reinforced company with 6 11-man A teams and support personnel. For the CT mission, the overall command structure was called the Special Action Force, SAF, while each A team was known as a Special Action Team, SAT. The teams were further organized as 2 4-man assault teams and a 3-man sniper-spotter team. Each section was led by the most experienced member, not necessarily the senior officer or non-commissioned officer. Standard unit firearms, including the Walther MPK submachine gun and the P-38 pistol, were carried. The sniper teams were equipped with the M21 and Remington 40 XB sniper rifles and the Heckler & Koch HK-21 machine gun. There were also some special weapons available for certain requirements. Training. Later, the unit's operations officer, Captain Peter Kelly, and its senior enlisted man, Sergeant Major Jeff Raker, both German expatriates, were able to arrange training with the German Border Police CT unit, Bundesgrenzschutz Gruppe 9, GSG 9, and the Berlin Police's SEK, or Sondereinsatzkommando. The Germans gave new insights into useful tactics and techniques, but in many ways they were less prepared than their guests, the men from Detachment A. Being essentially police SWAT teams, they had little concept of or experience with unconventional warfare, especially tradecraft in an urban environment or the use of heavier weapons. One of the skills Det A brought to the game was the ability to go undercover as an operational team, whereas most police officers were not at all prepared to undertake such missions. It should be noted that a number of the unit's men had been formally assigned to Military Assistance Command Vietnam's Studies and Observation Group, MACV SOG, which carried out clandestine operations in Southeast Asia in the 1960s and early 1970s. The detachment also counted among its members a number of troops who had cross-trained with the British Special Air Service, SAS, and were critical to integrating advanced methods of close-quarter battle, CQB. Many others had set up and trained American police departments in urban SWAT tactics. Additional weapons training was done at Fort Bragg, with the short-lived Blue Light unit at the Mott Lake compound, with at least 2.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?